Judge Harrison Blackwood thought he owned his courtroom. For 15 years, he had ruled from his bench with an iron fist and a cruel tongue, believing his black robes made him untouchable. But when he decided to humiliate a disabled war veteran in open court, he made one critical mistake. He forgot that justice doesn't always come from the bench. Sometimes it comes from the gallery, delivered by someone who knows what real fighting looks like. If you want to see the moment a corrupt judge met his match, hit that like button. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe because this is the story of justice served cold. The Federal District Courthouse in downtown Los Angeles buzzed with its usual morning activity. Lawyers shuffled between courtrooms, carrying briefcases and whispered conversations. Court reporters set up their equipment, preparing for another day of legal proceedings. In Courtroom 4B, Judge Harrison Blackwood was preparing to hear a civil case that he already viewed as a waste of his valuable time. What the judge didn't know was that in the back row of the gallery, Mike Tyson sat quietly, waiting for his own hearing to begin. The boxing legend was there for a contract dispute with a former promoter, a routine matter that his lawyers said would take 5 minutes once called. He had arrived early and decided to observe the preceding case rather than wait in the hallway. Sergeant First Class Marcus Rodriguez entered the courtroom in his wheelchair, accompanied by his wife Sarah and their attorney David Chen. Marcus wore his dress blues, the same uniform he had worn when he received his Purple Heart, though now the left sleeve was pinned up where his arm used to be. His legs, both lost to an IED explosion in Kandahar, were represented by empty space beneath his jacket. Marcus was pursuing a civil lawsuit against the contractor whose faulty equipment had caused the explosion that cost him 3 limbs and nearly his life. After 3 years of delays, appeals, and bureaucratic stonewalling, this was supposed to be his day in court. Judge Blackwood entered with his usual pompous stride, black robes billowing behind him like the wings of some predatory bird. At 58, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been challenged, never been told no, never faced real consequences for his actions. His appointment to the federal bench had been controversial, rumors of political favors and backroom deals, but he had survived the confirmation process and now considered himself untouchable. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison Blackwood," called the bailiff. The courtroom stood, except for Marcus, who remained in his wheelchair. It was a simple matter of physics. He couldn't stand. But Judge Blackwood noticed immediately, and his eyes narrowed with displeasure.
"Be seated," Judge Blackwood commanded, settling into his chair with deliberate ceremony. He shuffled through the papers on his bench, making everyone wait while he established his authority over the room. His gaze kept returning to Marcus, and there was something cold and calculating in his expression. "Rodriguez v. Blackstone Defense Contractors," the clerk announced. "Case number 2024-CV-8847. Marcus's attorney stood to address the court. "Your Honor, we're here today seeking compensation for Sergeant Rodriguez's catastrophic injuries caused by the defendant's negligent—" Yes, I've read the briefs," Judge Blackwood interrupted with visible irritation. "Though I have to say, Mr. Chen, this case seems like a rather obvious attempt to extract money from a successful company using sympathy rather than actual legal merit." A murmur of shock rippled through the gallery. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine, surprised by the judge's openly hostile tone before any evidence had been presented. Marcus's wife, Sarah, gripped her husband's remaining hand tightly. They had expected a fair hearing, not a predetermined conclusion from a judge who seemed to have already made up his mind. In the back row, Mike Tyson shifted forward in his seat. He had been only half listening to the proceedings, but the judge's tone had caught his attention. There was something familiar about it, the sound of a bully picking on someone he perceived as weak. "Your Honor," Attorney Chen replied carefully, "with respect, we believe the evidence will clearly show—" "The evidence," Judge Blackwood cut him off again, "will show that we have another veteran looking for a handout instead of taking responsibility for the risks of military service." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. The court reporter's fingers froze over her machine for a moment before resuming their work. Marcus himself seemed to shrink in his wheelchair. He had faced enemy fire, survived a devastating explosion, endured dozens of surgeries, and fought through years of rehabilitation. But this casual dismissal of his sacrifice cut deeper than any physical wound. "Your Honor," Chen said, his voice now tight with controlled anger. "Sergeant Rodriguez served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He was injured while serving his country." "And now he wants the country to serve him?" Judge Blackwood replied with a smirk that revealed his true character. "How convenient." Mike Tyson's hands clenched into fists. He had seen enough injustice in his life to recognize it instantly, and this was injustice in its purest form. A man in a position of power, using that power to humiliate someone who had already sacrificed everything. Judge Blackwood was just getting started. He leaned forward on his bench, fixing Marcus with a contemptuous stare. "Tell me, Sergeant Rodriguez, did anyone force you to join the military? Did anyone force you to go to Afghanistan?" Marcus looked up at the judge, confused by the line of questioning. "No, Your Honor, I enlisted voluntarily." "Voluntarily," the judge repeated with satisfaction. "So you knew the risks. You knew that soldiers get injured in wars. You made a choice." "Your Honor, this line of questioning is completely inappropriate," Chen objected, rising from his seat. "Sit down, counselor," Judge Blackwood snapped. "I'll determine what's appropriate in my courtroom." He turned back to Marcus. "You made a choice to put yourself in harm's way, and now you want someone else to pay for the consequences of that choice. Is that correct?" Marcus struggled to find words. This wasn't how he had imagined his day in court would go. I was serving my country, Your Honor. The equipment failure, the judge interrupted, was a risk of the job you voluntarily chose. No one put a gun to your head and made you become a soldier." The cruelty of the comment was breathtaking. Here was a man who had lost 3 limbs serving his country, being told by a federal judge that his injuries were his own fault for having the audacity to serve in the first place. Sarah Rodriguez began to cry quietly, not from sadness, but from rage at seeing her husband treated with such contempt. Marcus himself sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that the American justice system, the same system he had fought to defend, was now attacking him. But Judge Blackwood wasn't finished. He had found his target, and like all bullies, he was enjoying the power he held over someone who couldn't fight back. "Let me ask you something else, Sergeant," the judge continued, practically spitting the rank like an insult. "How much are you seeking in this lawsuit? What's the price tag you've put on your inconvenience?" The word inconvenience hung in the air like poison. Marcus had lost 3 limbs, nearly died, spent 2 years in rehabilitation, and continued to struggle with chronic pain and PTSD. And a federal judge had just called it an inconvenience. That's when Mike Tyson stood up. The movement was so sudden and forceful that it drew every eye in the courtroom. The former heavyweight champion rose to his full height, his presence immediately dominating the room despite being in the back row. "Excuse me," Mike's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "What the hell did you just say?" Judge Blackwood looked up, startled. "Sir, you need to remain seated during proceedings." "No," Mike said, stepping into the aisle. "You need to shut your mouth before you embarrass yourself any further." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The bailiff moved toward Mike, but hesitated. This was Mike Tyson. You didn't just grab Mike Tyson and expect it to go well. "Sir, you cannot interrupt these proceedings," Judge Blackwood said, but his voice had lost some of its authority. He was clearly shaken by the sudden confrontation. "I can't interrupt?" Mike stepped closer to the bench, his voice rising. "You just called this man's service to his country an inconvenience, and you're worried about interruptions?" Mike turned to address the entire courtroom, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of commanding attention in hostile environments. Everyone in this room needs to understand what just happened here. This judge, this man who's supposed to represent justice, just told a triple amputee war veteran that losing his limbs was his own fault for having the nerve to serve his country. Judge Blackwood tried to regain control. "Bailiff, remove this man from my courtroom immediately." But the bailiff, a military veteran himself, didn't move. He had heard what the judge said, and he wasn't eager to remove someone who was defending a fellow veteran. Mike wasn't finished. He pointed directly at Judge Blackwood, his finger like a loaded weapon. "You want to know what an inconvenience is? An inconvenience is having to listen to a coward in a robe disrespect someone who's more of a man than you'll ever be. This man lost 3 limbs defending the Constitution that gives you the right to sit on that bench, and you have the nerve to mock his sacrifice?" The judge's face was now red with embarrassment and anger. "Sir, you are in contempt of court." "I'm in contempt of you," Mike shot back, "and so is everyone else in this room who has any decency left." Mike walked closer to Marcus's wheelchair, his voice softening as he addressed the veteran directly. "Brother, I want you to know that not everyone thinks like this clown. What you did over there, what you sacrificed, that's real courage. That's real strength. Don't let some pencil-pushing coward who's never faced a real challenge in his life make you question your worth." Marcus looked up at Mike with tears in his eyes, but they were tears of gratitude, not pain. For the first time since entering the courtroom, someone was treating him with the respect he deserved. Mike turned back to Judge Blackwood, and his voice took on that familiar edge that had terrorized opponents in the ring. "You know what your problem is, Judge? You think that robe makes you important? You think having a gavel gives you the right to judge a man who's shown more courage in one day than you've shown in your entire pathetic life?" "Bailiff!" the judge shouted, his voice cracking with panic.
"The bailiff's not moving," Mike observed calmly, "because he knows I'm right. Because everyone in this room knows I'm right. Because what you did here today wasn't justice. It was an abuse of power by a small man who gets off on hurting people who can't fight back." The courtroom was dead silent now, except for Mike's voice. Even the opposing counsel looked uncomfortable with their judge's behavior. "This man," Mike gestured to Marcus, "volunteered to put his life on the line for people like you. He didn't have to do it. He could have stayed home, gone to college, gotten a safe job. But he chose to serve. He chose to risk everything so that cowards like you could sit safely in your air-conditioned courtrooms and pass judgment on your betters." Judge Blackwood was now visibly sweating, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. And when he got hurt, when he lost 3 limbs serving your country, he didn't ask for a handout. He filed a legitimate lawsuit against a contractor whose negligence caused his injuries. That's not greed, that's justice. But you wouldn't know justice if it bit you on your privileged ass. The crowd was now openly supportive of Mike's intervention. Several people were nodding in agreement, and a few were quietly applauding. You called his service an inconvenience. You know what's an inconvenience? Having to sit here and listen to you disgrace the office you hold. Having to watch you humiliate a war hero because you think your position makes you untouchable. Mike's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouts. "Well, guess what, Judge? You're not untouchable. You're just a small, bitter man in a borrowed robe, and everyone in this room can see exactly what you are." Judge Blackwood tried one more time to assert his authority. "Mr. Tyson, you are in contempt of this court." "No," Mike cut him off. "You are in contempt of everything this court is supposed to represent. You're in contempt of justice, of decency, of basic human respect. You're a disgrace to that robe and a disgrace to this country." Mike turned to Marcus one final time. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you served with honor, you've suffered with dignity, and you deserve justice. Don't let this pathetic excuse for a judge make you feel otherwise. You're worth 100 of him, and everyone here knows it." Then Mike looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with the journalists who had been frantically taking notes. "And I want everyone who writes about this to make sure they get it right. A federal judge attacked a disabled veteran for having the nerve to seek justice after being injured serving his country. And when someone stood up to defend that veteran,
The judge tried to hide behind his contempt powers because he's too much of a coward to face the consequences of his own words. The silence that followed was profound. Judge Blackwood sat behind his bench, completely deflated. His attempt to intimidate a disabled veteran had backfired spectacularly, and now he was the one who looked small and powerless. Marcus's attorney, David Chen, found his voice. "Your Honor, in light of what has transpired here today, I believe it would be appropriate for you to recuse yourself from this case." Judge Blackwood looked around the courtroom, seeing only hostile faces and disapproving expressions. Even his own court staff looked ashamed to be associated with him. "This court is in recess," he mumbled, rising quickly from his bench and fleeing toward his chambers like a man running from a fire. As soon as he disappeared, the courtroom erupted in conversation. People were pulling out their phones, calling friends and family to tell them what they had just witnessed. Court reporters were already typing up their notes, knowing this would be front-page news by evening. Mike walked over to Marcus and knelt down beside his wheelchair. "Brother, what's your name?" "Marcus Rodriguez, sir. Sergeant First Class 10th Mountain Division." "Mountain climbers." Mike nodded with respect. "Tough unit. What happened to you over there?" As Marcus told his story, Mike listened with the kind of attention and respect that Judge Blackwood should have shown from the beginning. Other people in the courtroom gathered around to listen, many of them veterans themselves who had witnessed the judge's disgraceful behavior. Within an hour, video of Mike's confrontation with Judge Blackwood was trending on every social media platform. Someone in the courtroom had been live streaming the proceedings, and the clip of Mike defending Marcus was being shared faster than anyone could count. Hashtag Mike Tyson defends veteran began trending nationally within minutes. Hashtag Judge Blackwood exposed followed close behind. Veterans organizations across the country were sharing the video with messages of support for Marcus and gratitude for Mike's intervention. The story was picked up by major news networks within hours. Legal experts weighed in on Judge Blackwood's conduct, with many calling for a judicial ethics investigation. Military advocacy groups demanded his removal from the bench. Marcus Rodriguez, who had entered the courtroom that morning as just another plaintiff seeking justice, had become a symbol of the mistreatment veterans faced in a system that claimed to honor their service while failing to protect their rights. Judge Blackwood, meanwhile, had locked himself in his chambers and was refusing to speak to reporters. His clerk issued a brief statement saying the judge had no comment on the proceedings, but by then it was too late. The damage was done. Legal scholars noted that Mike Tyson had accomplished something that lawyers and advocates had been trying to do for years. He had exposed the ugly reality of how some members of the judiciary treated veterans and other vulnerable populations. 3 days later, Judge Blackwood announced his early retirement, citing health reasons. But everyone knew the real reason. He had been exposed as a bully and a coward, and his position had become untenable. Marcus Rodriguez's case was reassigned to a different judge, one who treated him with the respect and dignity he deserved. The settlement he eventually received was substantial, but more importantly, it acknowledged that his injuries were the result of negligence, not his own fault for choosing to serve. Mike Tyson, for his part, became an unlikely advocate for veterans' rights. His intervention in the courtroom had reminded people that real strength wasn't about physical power. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. "People think I'm this crazy, violent guy," Mike said in an interview weeks later. But the real violence was what that judge was doing to that veteran. The real craziness was watching a war hero get humiliated by someone who's never sacrificed anything for anyone. The incident became a case study in judicial misconduct and the importance of holding public officials accountable for their actions. Law schools began using the confrontation as an example of how power can corrupt and how ordinary citizens, even famous ones, have a responsibility to speak up when they witness injustice. Marcus Rodriguez used his newfound platform to advocate for other disabled veterans facing similar challenges in the court system. His story inspired changes in how federal judges receive training on veteran-related cases and PTSD awareness. "The funny thing is," Marcus said in a later interview, "I went to court that day, expecting justice from the system. Instead, I got justice from Mike Tyson. It shows you that sometimes the system fails, but people don't have to. The interview, conducted by a Veterans Affairs podcast, was downloaded millions of times. Marcus had found his voice as an advocate, and his message resonated with veterans across the country who had faced similar disrespect from officials who were supposed to serve them. As for the broader impact, the incident sparked a national conversation about how veterans were treated by the institutions they had sworn to protect. It highlighted the gap between the lip service paid to supporting our troops and the reality of how veterans were often treated when they sought help or justice. Mike Tyson's intervention had been more than just a moment of righteous anger. It had been a catalyst for change. It reminded people that justice doesn't always come from those in power. Sometimes it comes from those willing to challenge that power when it's being abused. Years later, when people talked about authentic moments of courage, they remembered the day Mike Tyson stood up in a federal courtroom and delivered justice, with his words instead of his fists. He had shown that real fighting wasn't about throwing punches, it was about throwing yourself into the path of injustice to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Judge Blackwood faded into obscurity, remembered only as a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked. Marcus Rodriguez became a respected advocate, whose story inspired others to speak up about institutional mistreatment. The incident proved that in a democracy, no one, not even a federal judge, is truly untouchable when they abuse their power. It showed that sometimes the most important battles don't happen in a ring, but in a courtroom, when someone with a platform chooses to use it for someone who needs it most. Most importantly, it demonstrated that justice isn't just a legal concept, it's a human responsibility. When Mike Tyson saw injustice happening in front of him, he didn't look away or assume someone else would handle it. He stood up, spoke out, and reminded everyone in that room what justice actually looks like. It was the day a corrupt judge mocked a disabled veteran in court, thinking his position made him untouchable. But Mike Tyson was there, and when he saw injustice, he didn't hesitate to deliver the justice that the system had failed to provide. Sometimes the most powerful punches are thrown with words, not fists. And sometimes the real champion isn't the one wearing a belt. It's the one wearing the courage to do what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs something. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're sitting in a courtroom, standing in a ring, or just trying to do the right thing in a world that doesn't always make it easy. Justice isn't just something that happens to us. It's something we make happen, one brave moment at a time. And on that day in Courtroom 4B, Mike Tyson reminded everyone what justice looks like when someone finally decides to fight for it.